guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about manual mode on your camera. Where you can find it is right here. On your mode dial, you'll go to the M in the creative zone. So get your manuals out and open up your index to look up manual. Manual mode in my index says it's on page 98, so I'm going to turn there. Go ahead and get your manuals out too. You can do this with me. Okay, so it's telling you where to locate it, manual mode, and how to set the shutter speed and the aperture. So my shutter speed is controlled by my dial here on the top. My aperture is controlled by this dial. So I set my, turn on my camera and go up one more notch to this little check mark, and that'll control my other dial. Then the ISO, as you remember, on my camera is the button up here and the dial right here, and I move that back and forth. So what happens when you take a picture is the light goes through the lens, which encases the aperture, and then it hits the shutter, which moves quickly across the body of the camera, and the light hits the image sensor, which is controlled by the ISO. I'm going to show you a chart now that shows how three of them work together to give the correct exposure. As you can see, you have ISO at the top, aperture to the right, and shutter speed to the left. It shows you how each of these work together to get the image that you want. So noise is affected by the ISO, the depth of field is affected by the aperture, and motion is affected by the shutter speed. In the middle, you'll see you've got the chart that tells you if you are over or under exposure. You want to be right in the middle. Right in the middle is where you have everything correct. Next, I'm going to show you a picture of a chart that shows the combinations of different exposures when you combine shutter speed and aperture. Okay, so here is my exposure chart. To the left, we have shutter speeds. To the top, we have f-stops. You'll find that f-stops and shutter speeds are standard. Okay, so if we have the f-stop of a 5.6 and a shutter speed of 1/4 of a second, you'll find that you'll see the number 7. The number 7 is its exposure value. Diagonally up and down, you'll see the exposure value is equivalent. So if you went down a stop for both exposure and shutter speed, aperture and shutter speed, you'll find another 7. That is equivalent. You'll have the same lights, mediums, and darks, but you'll have a smaller depth of field because you're using a smaller f-stop. So take another quick glance around this, and you'll find it's very helpful once you figure out what everything means. Even though that chart makes sense, it can seem a little overwhelming. So let's take a closer look at shutter speed. So here's a closer look at shutter speed. As you can see, if you want to catch fast motion, you need a shutter speed of 1/2000th or 1/1000th of a second. It's going to freeze time. Now, if you do a slow shutter speed, you're going to capture time. So you're going to capture something in motion, like water flowing, for example. This also affects how much light comes into the camera. Between each of these shutter speeds is called a stop. So if you have a 1/60th of a second in shutter speed and you want to find a lower aperture, you simply raise the shutter speed up to 1/25th of a second to make up for changing the aperture. Now I'm going to show you a chart of aperture values. Here's a breakdown of apertures. This is just some of the apertures and they're standard. So the smallest pinhole you'll see is at the f16. The largest one is at the f2. The f2 lets in a bunch of light. The f16 moves the light further back or for a larger depth of view. Here's another example. Smallest aperture to the right, largest aperture to the left at an f2. So let's do an example. If I took a correct exposure at a f8 with a 1/60th for a shutter speed, and I decided I wanted a shorter depth of field to focus on, so I went down to a 5.6 for my f-stop, my aperture. Because I'm letting in more light, I have to take away light somewhere. And so instead of a 1/60, I'm going to shorten my shutter speed to 1/125th of a second. That makes up the difference, and I still have the correct exposure. But say I wanted a larger depth of field. I would move from an f8, where I was before, to an f11. Because I wouldn't be letting as much light in there, I'd have to make up for it for somewhere else. I would have a longer shutter speed. I would move to 1/30th of a second because that is the next step down. Now if we combine the aperture value with a shutter speed, you still might not get the correct exposure that you're looking for. This is when ISO comes into play. Because of its sensitivity to light, it can make your images lighter or darker depending on what you need. So here's another chart breaking down the ISO, and then we're going to put it all together and I'll show some examples. So we're going to concentrate on ISO right here. Remember that ISO is the sensitivity of the image sensor inside of your camera, right inside your camera body. So the light comes into your camera, goes through the lens, which has the aperture. It reaches the shutter, moves through that, and it hits the image sensor. Now how sensitive the image sensor is up to you. So I hope you've been following along what these numbers mean. So here we get to 640 to 800, and there's a noise warning circle over here. This is what I was telling you about. The darker it is and the higher the ISO you use, you'll see lots of noise, and I have an example of that. So when you get ISO, shutter speed, and aperture as the three pillars of your photography, and you figure that out, you're going to have some perfect exposures. Okay, I hope you guys are following along really well. Here's a little example of something that you can remember when you go out shooting manual and off of the top of your head you need something fast. So this is called the Sunny 16. So you're going to turn on your camera to manual, set your aperture to 16, hence the Sunny 16, and this is if it's sunny outside, so a very bright ambiance. Okay, so manual, aperture to 16, and your ISO you're going to set to 100. And whatever your ISO is, you're going to match that to your shutter speed. So if your ISO is at 100, you'll set your shutter speed to the number closest to 100. Mine will be at 90. So the Sunny 16. Set your f-stop at 16 when it's sunny outside. Set your ISO to 100 and your shutter speed to 100, or the closest numbers to that. Okay, so this is what mine looks like now. My ISO is at a 200 because I don't have a 100, so I just did the closest there. My f-stop is at 16 for the Sunny 16 rule. And 90, that's 1/90th of a second. That's the closest to my ISO. That is a good starting point. If you find that you need a little more light or a little less light, just move your aperture or shutter speed up or down according to what you need. Or you can move your ISO up if you need more sensitivity. Okay, let's take a look at this chart again. As you can see, the f-stops are at the top, the shutter speeds are on the left. And when you follow the lines in, you'll find that you've got the numbers. The numbers and the colors coincide. Now you can see the correct exposure value, and you know what it all means. Here's a helpful cheat sheet that I got off the internet from a website that's at the bottom of the page. But let's start with exposure. So everything we need for a perfect picture, at the end we'll measure its exposure. It may be overexposed, underexposed, or evenly exposed, and we can fix that using our exposure compensation, and you know how to do that. The aperture goes from an f1.4 to an f16, so that's a range of whether you see a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field, and this depends on what lens you have. Your lens may not be capable of going down to an f2 or an f1.4. It'll say on the outside of your own lens. Here's our shutter speed. It lists all the available shutter speeds. And remember, with the longer shutter speeds, you're always going to want to use a tripod or something to steady your camera, or you're going to have a shaky picture, blurry picture that you're just going to want to throw away. And now we have your ISO, your image sensor's sensitivity of light, located in your camera body. So the lowest ISO you can go is 100, and clear up. You can even go up to 25,000 if your camera allows it. My camera only allows me to go down to 200 and up to 3200, so it just varies with your camera. Okay, let's talk about your homework. Take a look at your dial mode. In the basic zone, there is a picture of a girl again. That's portrait. I need you to take a portrait of someone using only manual mode. Take a landscape, only using manual mode. That will be with a higher f-stop. Micro, that will be with a lower f-stop. Action shot, that will be with a quick shutter speed. And an evening shot, that will be used with a tripod with a slow shutter speed. That will be all of your homework for today. Good luck, you'll do great, and I'll see you next time. Bye.